Welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast. BrightWord is a leading platform for diverse storytelling, where voices from all backgrounds can share their unique narratives and connect with readers from around the world. Follow our regular podcast updates, where we strive to foster a literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast. I'm your host, John Lobb, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Tom Francis Ramos, author of From Berkeley to Berlin, How the Rad Lab Helped Avert Nuclear War. Tom takes us back to November 1960, when a young John F. Kennedy stepped into the White House and into the heart of a Cold War standoff. At stake, the fate of Berlin and possibly the world. But behind the scenes of diplomacy and brinkmanship, a group of brilliant physicists at a California lab, led by Ernest Lawrence and joined by J. Robert Oppenheimer, were racing against time. From Nazi Germany's atomic ambitions to the Soviet Union's growing nuclear threat, their work shaped the very balance of global power. Today we explore that story of how a team at UC Berkeley's Rad Lab helped the U.S. stare down Khrushchev, avert nuclear war, and build a legacy of scientific resistance in the atomic age. Tom, welcome. Such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
What a fascinating topic. Maybe just to kick us off, help our viewers understand how this book came to be.
Sure will. I'm a former nuclear weapons designer. Back, about 15 years ago now, I was asked to start giving lectures to newly hired physicists. The laboratory was in a big flux, and about 50% of the people at the lab had just been hired in the last 5 years, and they had no idea. There were those of us who had actually been through a nuclear test, understood all of the ramifications and how complicated those things are. There were very few of us left coming on, and so I was asked to give lectures to these young people. This is how we did things. This is why we did it in designing stuff. And of course, of doing that, it got bigger and bigger, and the topic got bigger and bigger. And the associate director of the laboratory asked me now to start giving broader lectures to bigger audiences. And I thought, oh God, I better make sure what I'm saying is correct. So I called up actually the leading figures from those days back in the 1950s. And these were very prominent. They were very prominent in American history. Harold Brown would later become Secretary of Defense with Jimmy Carter. Johnny Foster would become the third ranking member of the Defense Department for 3 Secretaries of Defense, 2 presidents, Lyndon Johnson. And Mike May was another leading member of the country in getting us through arms control talks. So anyway, so I went to see those 3 gentlemen. Herb York was another friend, but unfortunately Herb York had just died before that. But anyway, I went and I spent about 2 days with each of them, and they looked over my notes because I'd been reading through hundreds of documents in tucked sheep vaults at Livermore and in Los Alamos trying to figure out why these guys were doing what they were doing. And all 3 of them said, yeah, Tom, you got it right. They each had suggestions how to make it better. But it was Harold Brown who said, Tom, you need to make this an unclassified book, history. And I smiled at him and said, yes, sir. And went back to Livermore and said, how the hell do I do that? These are about making nuclear weapons. How do I make that an unclassified history? But
it doesn't get much more top secret than nuclear weapons, I imagine.
The whole thing was top secret. I mean, all my lectures were top secret. So, but when Harold Brown says something, people, you work, you go and you do it. So I did a lot more reading and tried to understand the politics behind that. And I decided with the unclassified book, I'd go more into the characters and who they were rather than the gadgets they were making. I would do more on the characters. And that became a long, long book. And it was at that time is when I discovered that there was a huge crisis had occurred in the Kennedy administration that I was I was really unaware of. It was in 1961. I mean, I was a teenager at the time. The Beatles were the biggest thing in the news, for goodness sake. But a really dramatic thing was happening behind the scenes. Now, we all know about the Cuban crisis of 1962, a year later. And I distinctly remember getting on it, watching the TV and Kennedy pounding his chest and telling what he was going to do to the Russians if they ever launched a missile out of Cuba and that. But then what happened is 2 years after Kennedy was assassinated, the Kennedy Center was created, and they interviewed every member of Kennedy's National Security Council. And these were intensive interviews, some lasting 2 days. And they all were unanimous in saying, well, yeah, Cuba was bad, but not as bad as Berlin. Berlin was the bad crisis. That
Wow.
was a real serious one. And that got me, what the heck was going on in Berlin? And then I really started reading that. And in essence, in the book, it comes out, Khrushchev had given Kennedy an ultimatum. Kennedy was only president for about 100 days, 150 days. And Khrushchev, who was the political commissar of the Central Soviet Army in World War II, working directly for Stalin. His theater included Stalingrad, for goodness sake. And when he had to deal with Eisenhower, Eisenhower was a 4-star general, theater commander. But then he had a PT boat commander as president, and he thought I could take over. He could take Kennedy. Kennedy would not have enough guts, especially after he saw the Bay of Pigs fiasco that we had. He thought Kennedy lost his nerve during that. So Khrushchev thought he could take him, and the Russians badly, from Stalin to Khrushchev, badly wanted to take over Western Europe to communism. And so when they met in Vienna, Khrushchev gave Kennedy an ultimatum: you get your troops out of Berlin. You have 6 months to get them out because the Red Army is going to occupy the city, and I will not be responsible for anyone we kill. If there are any Americans there, it's not my responsibility if they're killed. And Kennedy was looking at him. Kennedy realized he was not going to do that. He got elected on a platform of being tough on communism. He was not going to abandon 2.5 million Germans to communism. He just wasn't going to do it. And so he came back to Washington. He met with his staff, and his face was white with stress. And he told his staff, we are going to have a thermonuclear war in 6 months. Be prepared. Let's get ready. He wrote 6 executive orders, all dealing with Berlin, even though it didn't say Berlin. But for example, in one, he ordered the construction of fallout shelters all over America. And I remember as a kid going to Macy's in Manhattan and seeing they were constructing this fallout shelter in the basement. I was like, what the hell was that about? It was because of this executive order. It was serious. And Kennedy even went to the Pentagon to meet with the leaders there. And so what's the plan? And the general in charge of the defense, General Clay, his name was Lucius Clay, he was responsible for the defense of Germany. He says, yes, sir. Well, if the Russians decide, if the Red Army decides to invest Berlin, we're going to send a tank-heavy task force out of Frankfurt to go. And if we meet any resistance, or if they try to destroy the task force, we will meet them with tactical nuclear weapons. And Kennedy goes, okay, this is serious stuff. This is very serious stuff. So the fact that Kennedy would not back down, he would not back down in front of Khrushchev, and the fact that by the time the ultimatum was coming up, Khrushchev would suddenly blink and back down. And instead of invading Berlin, he builds the Berlin Wall. That's the reason the Berlin Wall was built, if anyone's interested. It was to stop this crisis, and the crisis stops because Khrushchev backed down Kennedy. And so if you ask the question, what happened? What happened to cause Khrushchev to back down? That's the essence of my book. And it was the strength of Kennedy's deterrence strategy and how he just had the intestinal fortitude to follow through. He was a great leader. Didn't go around bragging about it or anything else, but he stopped a very catastrophic event from happening. We were very, very close to nuclear war, and none of us knew about it. So that's the essence of my book. And how did we accomplish that is what the book's about.
Oh, man. And a lot closer, I think, than I realized, and maybe a lot of our audience realized. Just fascinating. Do you think that was the genesis of this theory that they call mutual assured destruction, or MAD, where each side could destroy the other? Was that what in play at the time, or what exactly stopped one side from pulling the trigger in that case?
Yeah. Originally, in the Eisenhower administration, if there was going to be a big aggression, if the Russians were going to come and invade Western Europe, Eisenhower's declared policy was a thing he called massive retaliation, which was be like a World War II thing. He would take every bomber we had, each bomber would carry a hydrogen bomb, and they would go over Russia and they would just obliterate Russia off the face of the earth. That was Eisenhower's strategy. And then many wise policymakers, especially from Rand Corporation, the Air Force at the end of World War II created a project called RAND. RAND, by the way, stands for Research and Development. But they started the RAND project, and the head of Douglas Aircraft gave this property he owned in Santa Monica, California, And he told the Air Force, you can have this property. And they created RAND project at Santa Monica. And RAND soon brought in some of the biggest thinkers of our time. And they looked at the Eisenhower policy, which is this massive retaliation, which later got corrupted into MAD, that became the MAD thing, mutually assured destruction kind of thing. This was not, the authors didn't come up with that term. That was more the detractors came up with the term MAD. But anyway, they looked at massive retaliation. This is, it's not going to work, because what will happen is the Russians will do smaller things. They'll invade Ukraine or something. They'll do something smaller, in which we will say, well, that's not worth starting World War III over. So, and that would encourage the Russians actually to become aggressive rather than deterring them.
And giving them an inch at a time.
What we need is a much more flexible thing, and you need to deter them by putting at risk what they value most, or their ability to do what they want to do, so that they can't get away with it. And that's a much wiser, a much more flexible way of going about it. And they would say, well, we need to go after their forces that they would use. And this became a strategy known as counterforce. And I explain this a bit in my book. And Kennedy adopted that strategy. And in his inaugural address, 1961, he brings it out. And he's on, there's a guy named Bill Kaufman is one of these guys who wrote that strategy in a book. And Kennedy's paraphrasing it, saying, this is what we're going to do. It's much more, it meant, however, much more effort. It was not a cheap way out. It was much more effort. That's the strategy that Kennedy brought in, and it was really effective because because it was credible. The Russians believed we would do this now because it was a much more credible response than massive retaliation. Which, are you really willing to start World War III over invading Lithuania or something, or whatever the task was? No, that was not credible. But what Kennedy came up was a credible deterrent, and that worked. That really did work.
Wow. Real synergy between the scientists and the military leaders at the time. Do you think that evolved through mutual respect, or the fact that they needed each other, or did it evolve through conflict?
I think it's the latter, John. I think, we were just, 8 years following World War II, which was horrific destruction of the world. You didn't need an atom bomb to destroy lots of things. And people were well aware of a tyrant like Hitler or a Japanese Tojo, what they were capable of doing. And that Stalin, who killed more Ukrainians than Hitler killed Jews. I mean, Stalin in the 1930s starved to death over 8 million Ukrainians because they opposed his agricultural program. So this guy was a thug, and he was a dangerous thug. And if he was threatening, he definitely had his eyes set on Europe, on taking over Europe. And so there was a very, very clear picture in everyone's mind. This is very serious. And it was very fresh in their minds how Hitler came to power, all the things that Hitler did. And he suddenly, next thing you know, he's in power, and he's a madman with an army behind him, that Stalin could easily do this. He had a bigger army than Hitler had. So yeah, everyone could gather together and see this real big threat and work towards the greater good, which is what they did. And so you had this, I found quite unique. One of the things I was trying to do is compare Los Alamos to Livermore, how the two laboratories started. Los Alamos started in the war, and they were trying to get the best scientists of the day to get together and work on this. And we had great minds. Enrico Fermi was there, Hans Bethe, all these Nobel laureates were there. But in the Cold War, what happened, and it happened at Livermore, which is not as well known, is they brought together world-class policymakers, mostly from Rand Corporation. Partly the reason for that is that the people at Rand had worked with Lawrence before the war, and they knew Lawrence and they trusted Lawrence. And when these crises were building up, some of these great policymakers, Bill Kaufman, Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, who Hollywood would later call Dr. Strangelove, the original character, Strangelove, he was living in Livermore. He was there at Livermore, and he wrote on thermonuclear war, and the term doomsday machine, that came from Herman Kahn. So these individuals were all living in at Livermore, and they were working hand in glove with the physicists who were designing the weapons. They were saying, no, if you want this thing to make sense, it's got to be smaller, it has to do this and that. And that was a result of Lawrence's management style. Lawrence had a thing we called matrix management, in which you created a program and said, I got a problem I want to solve. You're the program leader, solve it. And then a program leader could cherry pick around the organization and get a diverse, by diverse, I mean diverse in expertise. There's not a bunch of dullards that look different. These are really talented people, but they had different expertises to themselves. And he put that program together. And so it was easier for policymakers, political scientists to fit in with physicists and engineers and come together. And the policymakers would tell them, look, if you want this thing to be credible, to make sense, they can't be big. These weapons got to be small so that we can get them on platforms and make them survivable. In order to make your deterrent credible, it has to survive a surprise attack from the Russians. Otherwise, the Russians will just kill your nuclear weapons or shoot your nuclear, and then you don't have it, and so it's not credible. And so the scientists said, okay. And so they worked really hard at Livermore, and they set records for making these things smaller and smaller. And they were achieving things. I mentioned in my book, a British Nobel laureate. So what you're trying to do is impossible. You can't do it. And in 24 months, they did do it. And in fact, that's the secret of what gave Kennedy the backbone to stand up to Khrushchev 15 years later.
Wow.
So there was yes.
What a brilliant collection of minds. I mean, it's just amazing. And yet you mentioned in the book that they were ridiculed at times or faced personal setbacks.
Yeah.
How could someone ridicule great thinkers like that?
That's interesting. And it's true even today. And of course, what I get into, I was writing a story, by the way, that comes from my Irish-born grandmother. I have a Portuguese name, but on my mother's side, I'm all Irish. And I grew up with my Irish-born, and she's what the Irish would call a Shaughnessy. It's a storyteller. It's just, when I was growing up, my oh, Tommy, let me tell you, when I was a little girl and I'd worked in O'Connell's, that's the English I learned to grow up. And it wasn't until I was in the Army, I was told that was an accent. What accent? What's this? So anyway, so I needed to make this a story. What I realized I needed, for a story, you need a hero, and the hero has to accomplish a great deed. And it became clear to me the hero was Lawrence, Ernest Lawrence. He was the man who was almost single-handedly trying to get the government to face up to the fact that we had a nuclear threat coming from Europe that we have to face. The first was the atomic bomb and the Germans, and the second one later would be the hydrogen bomb and the Russians. And he had to get this done. And the drama that came about is that for whatever reason, Oppenheimer, at the end of World War II, it turned very anti-nuke, and he was very much against this thermonuclear research that was first suggested by Fermi, Enrico Fermi, and then picked up by Fermi's really close friend, Edward Teller. Teller and Fermi met each other in 1933, and they worked together. And Fermi posed a question to Teller. He says, do you think we could use an atom bomb to make fusion reactions, like what makes the sun give off energy? And that became an obsession for Teller. And Teller formed a group. They put it together at Los Alamos. And later on, at a conference they were having, they found out one of the principal members of that group from Britain was Klaus Fuchs, who the British arrested in 1950, I think it was 49 or 50, as a Soviet spy. And they realized everything we knew about thermonuclear research, the Russians did. And Lawrence was convinced the Russians were going to start a thermonuclear program and they were going to have a hydrogen bomb, which is true. They did. In 1946, they started their program. We found this out after the wall came down. And so Oppenheimer, for whatever reason, said, no, we can't do that. And he tried to sabotage any efforts to do thermonuclear research. And it caused a split, especially between Lawrence and Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was very friendly. He had a lot of communist friends. His wife, his sister, and his brother and his mistress were all card-carrying communists. And he would fail any kind of classification test. And in fact, President Eisenhower ordered his clearance revoked. And he took away his clearance.
Wow.
Unlike the movie. I know the movie has this guy Strauss do it, but no, it was Eisenhower himself who ordered Oppenheimer's clearance struck. And it was Oppenheimer who demanded to have a hearing to clear his name. So they had the hearing. The first thing they asked him was, you lied to security personnel about attempts of the Communist Party to get secrets from you. Why did you do that? And he says, because I was an idiot. He admitted, yeah, he lied. He lied about it. He hired communists to do stuff. And then after the war, Oppenheimer became an opponent to this thing, and it really caused this digression. And it took sides, kind of like our politics today. Sides formed, and there was a lot of friction between the two. And when at the hearing, they wanted Lawrence, Taylor, Louis Alvarez, another Nobel laureate, David Griggs. These are individuals in my book They wanted them to testify at the hearing how Oppenheimer had stymied thermonuclear research. And for that performance, they were ostracized by the physics community of America. In fact, I interviewed physicists who worked in the 1950s at the lab, and they said, Tom, the first time I even heard the word Livermore was when I was in graduate school, and I was given a petition to sign that condemned the place. It was that bad. And yes, they so socially they did suffer. John Wheeler was ostracized. These were great physicists. Wheeler's probably the greatest American physicist of the 20th century. If you're going to tell me, no, that's Richard Feynman, I'd say, well, who was Feynman's thesis advisor? That was John Wheeler, the man who gave us the phrase black hole to describe a star so massive. That phrase comes from Wheeler. All of these individuals were being ostracized because they were opposing Oppenheimer. And they said, no, we better do this so the Russians are going to have a hydrogen bomb all by themselves. So there was a lot of passion.
Well, they say if those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat.
Yeah.
What lessons can we take from the Rad Lab as we sit here in 2025? The world is obviously a very different place, and yet there's as much, if not more, conflict than ever.
Yeah.
What can we take from the past?
I really believe we can look at what happened from President Kennedy all the way down to the President Kennedy, who was a PT boat commander in World War II, but he was our president, and how steadfast he was on his backing up his principles, that he had intestinal fortitude. He did not give an inch to Khrushchev, and he is the man who would inspire the physicists who are passionate that we would be in a position of strength, not a position of weakness, when you have to suddenly come to and negotiate, like with arms control or other kinds of things. You better do it from a position of strength. Otherwise, they're going to roll all over you. And so what you don't do is like if Putin stands up and says tactical nuclear weapon, oh, okay, hold on. Or we don't make arms control agreements an end in itself. Arms control can be useful, but the end is to make us secure. The end is we want to avoid war. And you don't avoid war and that's what we saw in 1961. Everyone was together. If we're going to go into a crisis mode, we better do it from a position of strength. By the way, some historians do know that Kennedy, 2 years after this crisis, went to Berlin, and he gave that famous phrase, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which was on all the newspapers, and hardly anyone knows what did he mean by that. And what he was saying to them is, like in 1961, I am with you. I will never give you guys up. That's the lesson from history. You have to deal in a position of strength if we're going to deal with aggressors. Otherwise, they'll take advantage. They'll walk all over you. And we need to know that. We have to unite. We have to be together, and we have to be strong. And that's the biggest lesson I think we can have. And then we'll have peace.
Absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of Reagan with the Star Wars initiative. Not so much that he built part of it or never built any of it, but the fact is they said to themselves, this guy might be just crazy enough to build that thing.
Which made it credible. You're right. You're also right. I was in the Star Wars program. Of course, I was a designer of the X-ray laser. But every one of those programs in Star Wars started in the Carter administration, not in the Reagan administration. It was just Reagan who decided to make a policy of it, if you will. And you're right. He was credible in a sense that he would not give in. And of course, Brezhnev and Andropov and all those guys, and eventually Gorbachev would come around saying, well, this guy's for real. We better accommodate him. And that's what works. You're right.
What do you think if Ernest Lawrence and his team were around today, what do you think they would say from their experience and their perspective? And what would they make of the world in 2025?
John, I have no doubt that Lawrence, like he did twice before, would get on the first airplane to Washington, D.C., meet with Washington officials and tell them we have a huge threat, this time coming from 4 countries, but Russia and China, as well as Iran and North Korea. We have a problem heading our way, and this time it's not going to be a massive attack over the North Pole, which we're prepared for. We have a strategic deterrence for that. What we need to be careful about is they could very well use tactical nuclear weapons to solve a regional problem. And that would easily could lead to World War III. So we need to have a way to deter them from using tactical nuclear weapons on their regional problems, like in Ukraine or in Taiwan. I asked some friends, I said, imagine if someone went up to Putin and said, hey, Vladimir, here, just stick this tactical nuclear weapon into one of your hypersonic missiles. Let's shoot it at Kyiv, at the palace in Kyiv, and you can kill Zelensky real quick. And then you won't have a war. And you won't destroy the Russian economy. And you'll be all over. And people will condemn you. But so what? They're condemning you anyway.
Reputation can't get much worse.
You can't get much worse. And so would a megalomaniac like Putin, would he say, that's a good idea? And would he use one of these tactical nuclear weapons to achieve a regional goal? And that could easily blow up in our face into a world war. So we need to be able to deter those individuals from thinking they could get away with that kind of aggression. And we're not kind of prepared for that anymore. And I think you'd find Lawrence would be panicked. We need a credible deterrent to stop that from happening. And that's what he would do. And he would have the good physicists back in Livermore. He says, all right, you people get together. I want to have a solution and I want it tomorrow, kind of thing. And that's what you'd see.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I have to admit, Tom, when I think of a physicist working in a nuclear laboratory, I have the impression of a Poindexter with a pocket protector sitting in a windowless office. You strike me as such a personable guy. Did you find that you were able to draw on your storytelling ability in creating the book?
Yes, definitely. That was my first law is if you're going to give a thing, and frankly, is having a brain cramp. The great historian who wrote Guns of August, the lady, she won the Pulitzer Prize. She taught me this is how you write history. You make it a story. I apologize. I know she died, but she became an inspiration to me. This is the way you write history. It's not a series of facts. You have to understand the reasoning. Why was this stuff happening? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? And it just seemed natural, as I mentioned with my grandmother and my mother. They only spoke to you in terms of, my grandmother would say, "Oh, Tommy, you were born on April 3rd. No. Oh, Tommy, it was Holy Thursday evening and it was snowing. It was a cold evening. That was the night I was born. That's just the way I grew up. And so, John, it was
And the
natural.
details are what make any story compelling.
Because they're important. They explain, they begin to, I think I understand that individual. And that's when I came, for a story, you have to have a hero. And as I was going through this stuff, I came again and again and again to Lawrence, who's not really well appreciated. I mean, you have a movie about Oppenheimer, for God's sake, and Lawrence shows up as this little figure in one scene. By the way, every character in that movie, Oppenheimer, is in my book. I mean, they're all important figures. But Oppenheimer was not the central figure. It's Lawrence. And then Lawrence picked out these incredibly talented individuals. They each had the same story, by the way. They would be working at his Rad Lab in Berkeley, and they would be getting ready for a really important experiment, and they wanted to make sure the bloody experiment worked exactly right because their fame was at stake. And so on a Sunday night, let's say the night before, on a Sunday night at 10 o'clock, they'd be in the laboratory tinkering. And I heard the story from three individuals that they heard something and they turned around and it's Lawrence. And Lawrence would get down and lean down over. This is a Sunday night at 10 p.m. And Lawrence is in the laboratory. And he goes, "What you doing?" And Lawrence would see what he's doing. And he'd always have suggestions about, well, here, why don't you try this? He was a world-class experimentalist. I mean, when he was a graduate student.
And a question asker.
And a question asker. And he knew.
Curious man. Yep.
And he also knew these are the people, these are the guys who get things done. These are the ones who are willing to 10 o'clock the night before their experiment. They're going to get in there and they're going to make sure this thing is going to work because they're not going to be embarrassed by this experiment. And so when it came to where he had to pick the leaders for his laboratory, he knew exactly who to pick. He knew who are the good guys, who are his go-getters. And so it was not an accident that we had people like Herb York, Johnny Foster, Mike May leading the laboratory in those first 10 years and that led to this great crisis that we were able to overcome. Because we had great people, and frankly, if you go back, Lawrence was the core of it. He was the guy that made it all happen.
Wonderful, wonderful. What a fascinating story, and it must have been challenging at times. You're dealing with sensitive history, formerly the top most secret information.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, did you have to have the book cleared by anybody? Were you careful not to reveal something that you shouldn't have?
Oh, did I? Yeah. Yes, I knew it. We have from the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, he created a classification thing called Q, a Q clearance. And a Q clearance means you're allowed to see nuclear secrets. You're allowed to see how a nuclear weapon is put together. Even today, in order to work on a nuclear weapon, you need a Q clearance. So naturally, all my lectures are all Q classified things, and that's top secret. That's related as top secret. And now, so I had to express things that I read in these top secret documents and put them into a form that was unclassified. So I spent
And understandable, right?
and
By your
understandable. Yes, you're right.
enjoyable to read.
My son and my daughters, they spared me no drift was there anything. And I remember my son saying, "Dad, not everyone thinks physics is neat stuff. Okay. I have no idea what the hell you're talking about." So, okay, I got it. And so, yeah, I'd have to reinterpret it. And then ironically, I did go through reading and I got the Department of Energy puts out these clearance guides, what's secret, what's not secret. And so I remember reading through all of these things and learning how to word things. And then I sat at Livermore, we have a classification office, and I had the director and the deputy director, and the two of them read through my whole manuscript. And then we sat for 2 solid days going over each sentence of the book, making sure, that it was. And even though everything was not classified, I found out they were very sensitive about words, especially back in Washington, where they're not necessarily scientists. They're not. And so, for example, I'll give you one example. I had the word thermal equilibrium in my manuscript. And in Washington, they said, "This is top secret." And so I changed it to, "They reached the same temperature." And that was okay. All right. They were fine with that. And I didn't bother to tell them it's the same thing. I started joking with them. I said, "God," I said, "if I said F equals MA, you'd call it top secret," because I was using Newton's laws and I said, but anyway, I followed their so a lot of times it was just as easy as that, carefully choosing the correct words. But sometimes I remember once spending 3 weeks. It was revolutionary in order to make these weapons smaller. The physicists did have to do some phenomenal physics. And I remember when I was first reading through the notes of these guys, they were writing their progress reports back in the 1950s. In fact, one even said, "Last week I spent a week doing slide rule calculation." But anyway, I remember going through this thing and I'm reliving those days, and it's, holy God, what's these guys thinking? I mean, it really was revolutionary change. And
Absolutely.
I wanted to express to a reader that this was really revolutionary, what these guys did. So I'd use words like they made the smallest warhead ever known to mankind, and it worked, or I would use like that and not tell them exactly why it worked or how it worked. I just said they did something that was never done before. And like with Mike May, his very first attempt at a weapon eventually became the largest yield weapon in the American stockpile, and it was there for almost 3 decades. This was his first attempt.
Wow.
That's to give you so I can use words like that to tell you how incredibly smart these guys was. Or with Johnny Foster, if you remember the Fat Man device, it's 5 tons. Johnny got his group, they got it down to a warhead which you could hold with your 2 hands, and it gave better performance than that big monster. And I would use kind of similes like that to express what they did was amazing. And they did it over the course of 24, 36 months. All I could say is there was a British Nobel laureate that said, "You can't do what you guys are doing." And they did it.
And they did it.
Von Neumann, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, he also came out to Livermore. He was living out in Livermore, and he was working with these guys, as well as John Wheeler, giving them seminars, and they were just coming back to Mike. I asked Mike May, "Mike, how the hell did you ever come up with that idea? It's incredible." I mean, it was so, and he says, "Well, John von Neumann gave a small lecture." I was sitting there and I thought, "Hey, that's a good idea." And I look at Mike, and von Neumann came up to Mike and said, "Mike, I need you to write a computer code on how to do the what we call radiation transport for a thermonuclear weapon." What he meant was, how do you write a computer code that will explain how the energy goes from an atom bomb into what we call a secondary to make a hydrogen bomb? Explain, do the physics for that. And Mike says, "Yes, sir." And Mike goes back to his office, pulls a textbook down from his shelf, opens it up, and from raw physics starts writing a computer code. And this is long before we had Fortran or that. I mean, that was amazing. The work that they did was just holy cow. Chuck Leith is
Well, you have changed my view of a physicist by all means. And kind of reminds me of one of my college roommates. He went on to pursue a PhD in physics. And a couple of the guys were kind of razzing him and saying, what are you going to do with a PhD in physics? What do you do with that? And he turned to us, he said, gentlemen, when you have a PhD in physics, what can't you do?
That's right.
And he was so right.
I had a stent put in for my heart. And my cardiologist, number one in his class at Stanford, great man. And he's looking down at me and he goes, Tom, I need to tell you, I dropped out of physics and became a doctor instead. And I said, Bill,
you hopped off the table and said, well, you're not touching me.
Don't worry, Bill, you're not dumb. He said, yeah, you need to know that I couldn't take physics anymore. So I switched over to medicine.
That's great. Tom, our time unfortunately is run down, but before I let you go, for those who are considering purchasing the book, what would you hope that someone takes from reading the book that you produced?
I think it'll give them hope about today. Today we are facing some very serious situations with people like Putin and Xi Jinping, and with Kim Jong-il and the Ayatollah. I mean, these are dangerous times, and I think it would be uplifting. I think it's a good story. Look, we've faced this before, and we can get at it. And this is a great story. These were great Americans, got together and we got out of that fix, and we did it really well. We didn't have to pound our chest doing it. We just quietly did something that got us out of a lot of trouble. And I think they would find that uplifting. It's very pertinent for today. And that's why the title, From Berkeley to Berlin, Lawrence created that laboratory in Berkeley. Eventually it led to solving a crisis in Berlin. And that's the story. And if you ask, well, how did that happen? The book will tell you. And it's a great dramatic story. Now they can get it on Amazon. It's by Naval Institute Press. God bless the Navy. I'm a West Pointer. And for 1 hour a year, we beat Navy on the football field.
Oh, that's right.
But God bless the Navy. The book was published by Naval Institute Press. They were great. Tom exactly meets the ethics that we want from Naval Institute Press. So it was really great working with those wonderful people at Naval Institute Press. But you can get it on Amazon. Barnes & Noble sells it in the bookstores and some other bookstores. But I know Barnes & Noble has put it on their list. So if they need to get the book, if they're from Livermore, the Livermore Historical Society has a little bookstore in their museum. You can get it there. But if you're not from Livermore, which most people are not, you can get it from Amazon. Probably the quickest way would be Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Excellent.
And it's an easy read. It's 200 pages. I mean, it's not a tome by any means. I tried to keep it quick, or the old Army saying, keep it simple, stupid. Kiss.
Right. Excellent. We've been talking with Tom Francis Ramos, author of From Berkeley to Berlin, How the Rad Lab Helped Avert Nuclear War. Just a fascinating discussion, Tom. Thank you so much for your service to our country and for being with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It's been my pleasure, John. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And we'll see you all on the next episode of the BrightWord Books Podcast. You've been listening to the BrightWord Books Podcast, home of the literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss future episodes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.